The mountains do not care about your experience. They do not care about your high-end gear, your expensive bow, or the fact that you have people waiting for you back at the trailhead. In the crazy mountains of Montana, the peaks rise like jagged, broken teeth against a sky that can turn from sapphire to charcoal in the time it takes to draw a single breath. They call them the crazies for a reason. It is not just the terrain. It is the way the wind howls through the limestone chutes, sounding less like air and more like a chorus of things that should not have voices. In September of 2014, 38-year-old Aaron Hedges walked into those mountains. He was a man who had spent his life in the outdoors. He was fit, he was prepared, and he was hunting with friends. He carried a heavy pack filled with the essentials for a week in the high country. But the high country has a way of rewriting the rules of survival. It has a way of making the familiar look alien. Aaron was supposed to meet his friends at a specific camp. It was a simple plan. He was going to scout ahead, maybe find a better vantage point, and meet them at the cache. But Aaron never showed up. When the first 24 hours passed without a sign of him, the air in the camp grew thick with a different kind of cold. It was the cold of realization. His friends did not wait. They knew the crazies. They knew that a man alone in those peaks is a man in the crosshairs of something ancient and indifferent. They called for help, and the machinery of the modern world began to grind into gear. Search and rescue teams, helicopters with thermal imaging, and dozens of volunteers poured into the area. They expected to find him hunkered down under a shelf of rock, or perhaps nursing a sprained ankle by a stream. They did not expect the silence. They did not expect the mountain to swallow him whole without leaving so much as a footprint in the soft, dark earth. The searchers moved through the underbrush with a microscopic focus. They looked for the snap of a twig, the glint of a broadhead arrow, or the orange flicker of a survival whistle. The terrain was a nightmare of vertical drops and dense stands of subalpine fir. The needles of the trees were sharp and silver, smelling of citrus and rot. The ground was a carpet of decaying organic matter, damp and spongy underfoot, muffling the sound of the searchers' voices. They pushed through thickets of Devil's Club, the thorns tearing at their Gore-Tex jackets. The thermal cameras in the helicopters scanned the grey rock faces, looking for the bloom of heat that would signal a living human body. They found nothing. The mountains remained cold. The peaks of the crazies are composed of igneous rock, hard and unforgiving, and they seemed to absorb the heat of the searchlights rather than reflecting it back. It was as if the range itself was holding its breath. Then the weather turned. In the high country, a storm is not just rain or snow. It is a physical assault. A massive snowstorm rolled over the peaks, burying the search area under inches of heavy, wet white powder. The temperature plummeted to well below freezing. The wind whipped through the canyons at 40 miles per hour, turning the world into a blurring chaos of white and grey. For the searchers, it was a tragedy. For Aaron Hedges, if he was still out there, it was a death sentence. The snow covered any tracks he might have left. It filled in the depressions in the dirt and smoothed over the jagged edges of the talus slopes. The search was suspended. There is a specific kind of hollow feeling that comes over a rescue team when they have to pull back. It is the feeling of leaving a man behind in the dark. The feeling that the mountain has won the first round. When the snow finally melted, the search resumed, but it was no longer a rescue mission. It was a recovery. They were looking for a body. They were looking for the discarded remnants of a life. And that is when the anomalies began to surface. A pair of boots was found. They were miles away from where Aaron was last seen, and they were in a location that made no sense. They were sitting on a high ridge, tucked away in a spot that required an immense amount of physical effort to reach. But here is the part that makes the skin crawl. The boots were found on the opposite side of the mountain from where he should have been. To get there, Aaron would have had to hike over some of the most brutal vertical terrain in the range. And he would have had to do it while heading away from his camp, away from his friends, and away from safety. He was moving deeper into the heart of the crazies. The boots were not just discarded, they were placed. They sat there in the dirt, the leather cracked by the sun, and the laces still tied in neat knots. Why would an experienced hunter take off his boots in the middle of a subalpine wilderness? The ground there is sharp. It is covered in jagged shards of rock and freezing slush. To walk barefoot in that environment is to invite agonizing pain and rapid frostbite. Yet there were no signs of a struggle. There was no blood. There was just the silence of the high ridge and the two empty shells of his footwear. This is a recurring theme in these cases. The removal of clothing in extreme cold is often attributed to paradoxical undressing, a final stage of hypothermia where the brain misinterprets the freezing cold as a burning heat. But Aaron was an experienced woodsman. He knew the signs. and the distance he traveled to get to that spot defies the logic of a dying man. It suggests a purpose that we cannot comprehend. A year later, more items were found. His backpack was discovered in a completely different drainage miles away from the boots. It was lean and empty, its straps weathered by the elements. Then a hydration bladder was found. It had been turned inside out. This is a detail that investigators could not explain. Why would a man fighting for his life in a snowstorm take the time to pull a plastic water bladder inside out? It is a tedious, deliberate task. It requires fine motor skills that vanish when the body is in the grip of hypothermia. Some theorists suggest it was a signal. Others think it was the act of someone whose mind had been completely fractured by something they saw in the woods. Or perhaps it was not Aaron who turned it inside out. Perhaps it was a curiosity for something else that found his pack. The final discovery came in 2016. 2 years after Aaron vanished, a local landowner was out on his property, far below the high ridges where the search had been concentrated. He found remains. They were located near a small creek tucked into a grove of trees on a private ranch. This location was miles and miles away from the initial search area. It was down in the valley, in a place that Aaron could have reached only by navigating through miles of dense forest and steep descents in total darkness or a blinding snowstorm. His remains were scattered, the work of scavengers and time. But the mystery did not end with the discovery of his bones. It only deepened. He was found in a place where he could have easily seen the lights of the ranch house. He was within reach of salvation. And yet he died there in the trees. The path Aaron took was a zigzag of impossible proportions. He went up over the highest ridges, discarded his boots, traveled miles across the jagged spine of the mountains, and then descended into a valley far to the north. It is a route that no rational person would take. It is the route of someone being hunted or someone being led. In the world of the unexplained, there is a concept called the silent zone. It is a phenomenon where the forest suddenly goes quiet. The birds stop singing. The insects stop their buzzing. The very air seems to vibrate with an unseen presence. Many who have survived near misses in these areas report a sense of intense dread and a sudden loss of direction. They describe the landscape shifting as if the trees and rocks are moving when they are not looking. Aaron Hedges was a man who knew his way around a compass. But a compass is useless when the world itself has turned upside down. We have to look at the microscopic details. When the investigators examined the area where his remains were found, they found his bow. It was leaning against a tree. It had not been fired. His gear was scattered in a way that suggested he had been dropping things one by one like a trail of breadcrumbs that led to nowhere. There was no sign of a predator attack. No cougar tracks. No grisly sign. Just the bones of a man who had walked until he could walk no more. The official cause of death was listed as exposure, which is the catch-all term the authorities use when they have no other answers. It is a clinical word for a terrifying end. It means your heart slowed down until it stopped. It means your blood turned to slush in your veins. But it does not explain why he was where he was. It does not explain the boots on the ridge. There are those who talk about the hidden pockets of the crazies. They speak of ancient portals or entities that mimic the voices of loved ones to lure hunters away from the trail. It sounds like folklore until you look at the map. When you plot the locations of the items found, the lines form a pattern that defies the standard behavior of a lost person. A lost person typically follows the path of least resistance. They go downhill. They follow water. Aaron went uphill over the peaks and into the most difficult terrain imaginable before finally dropping into the valley. He bypassed easier routes. He ignored the logical paths to safety. It was as if he was trying to outrun something that was already inside his head, or something that was following him just out of sight. The crazy mountains are silent now, the snow once again capping the jagged peaks of Big Elk Canyon. But the files on Aaron Hedges remain open in the minds of those who study the patterns. We see this time and again in the high country. An experienced individual vanishes. The weather turns. Clothing is found in impossible places. The body is eventually discovered in an area that had been searched multiple times or in a location that requires superhuman endurance to reach. There is a cold, cynical reality to these cases. We like to think we are the masters of the wilderness because we have GPS units and satellite phones. But those devices are just plastic and silicon. They offer no protection against the ancient mechanisms of the mountains. They offer no shield against the things that live in the gaps between the trees. The story of Aaron Hedges is a reminder that we are only guests in the wild. And sometimes the host decides that the visit is over. We are left with the images of those boots sitting on the ridge, the laces tied, waiting for a wearer who will never return. We are left with the image of a man sitting in a grove of trees watching the lights of a ranch house in the distance, unable or unwilling to move toward the light. It is a chilling, unresolved conclusion to a life spent in the outdoors. The crazies keep their secrets well. They bury them under the snow and wash them away with the spring runoff. All that remains is the wind. And the wind in the crazies never sounds quite human. This pattern is not unique to Montana. It echoes through the archives of the missing. Take the case of Jared Atadero, who vanished in the Roosevelt National Forest in Colorado in 1999. He was only 3 years old, yet his remains were found years later at the top of a grueling vertical cliff face that would challenge an adult climber. Like Aaron, his clothing was found in a state that defied explanation, with his shoes and pants discovered in a way that suggested they had been carefully placed or moved by something other than a small child. The distance traveled and the terrain conquered in both cases suggest a force at work that does not follow the laws of biology or physics. These are not just disappearances. They are ruptures in the fabric of our reality. Then there is the case of Keith Parkins, who disappeared in the canyons of Utah. He was only 2 years old. He walked over 15 miles in less than 20 hours, crossing 2 mountain ranges and multiple fences in the middle of a freezing night. When he was found alive, he was in a catatonic state, unable to explain how he had traveled such a vast distance through such brutal terrain. These cases, like that of Aaron Hedges, point to a terrifying commonality. There is something in the remote corners of our world that can take a person and move them through the landscape like pieces on a board. Whether it is a physical predator we have yet to name or a topographical anomaly that bends distance and time, the result is the same. People go into the woods and the woods change them before taking them forever. We look at the maps and we see the dots. We see the locations of the boots, the packs, and the bodies. We try to connect them with logic, with science, and with reason. But the lines don't hold. The logic fails. When you sit in the dark and look at the files of the missing 411, you realize that we are not looking for a needle in a haystack. We are looking for the reason why the needle was bent into a circle. Aaron Hedges was a man of the mountains, and in the end, the mountains claimed him in a way that remains a jagged, uncomfortable mystery. Sleep well if you can, knowing that the wild is much larger and much hungrier than the maps would have you believe.